If you think house cats are just lazy pets who sleep all day, wait until you hear what Shadow did when everyone else gave up listening. It was 2:47 a.m. on a bitter February night in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, when Shadow first started his desperate chorus. The orange tabby had been circling the Miller family's two-story colonial home for 3 hours, his usually soft meows escalating into sharp, urgent yowls that cut through the winter silence like broken glass. Inside, Tom Miller rolled over in bed, pulling a pillow over his head. "That damn cat again," he muttered to his wife Sarah, who was already reaching for her earplugs. For the past week, Shadow had been acting strange, pacing the hallways, pawing at doors, and making sounds they'd never heard before. The veterinarian had found nothing wrong during Tuesday's checkup, dismissing it as behavioral changes from the recent arrival of baby Emma, now 3 months old. But Shadow knew something the humans didn't, something that made his heart race and his fur stand on end every time he approached the nursery. The first sign had appeared 5 days ago, a faint, sweet smell that didn't belong, not the familiar scent of baby powder or Sarah's lavender lotion, but something chemical and wrong that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. Shadow's enhanced senses, evolved from thousands of years of survival instinct, detected what human noses couldn't, the invisible danger creeping through their home. At night, that smell was stronger. Tom Miller was a man of routine. At 34, he managed the local hardware store with the same methodical approach he brought to everything else in life. Problems had solutions. Crying cats got locked in the basement. Simple. He'd grown up on his grandfather's farm where animals served purposes. Barn cats caught mice, dogs guarded property, and sentiment was a luxury they couldn't afford. When Shadow's cries intensified around 3 a.m., Tom's patience finally snapped. He stomped downstairs in his boxer shorts and thermal shirt, his breath visible in the unusually cold house. The thermostat read 68 degrees, but it felt more like 50. Probably just needs adjustment, he thought, making a mental note to check the furnace tomorrow. Shadow met him at the bottom of the stairs, weaving between his legs with desperate urgency. The cat's green eyes were wild, pupils dilated despite the hallway light. He ran toward the nursery, stopped, looked back at Tom, then repeated the pattern, the universal animal signal for "follow me." "Enough of this," Tom growled, scooping up the 18-pound tabby. Shadow's claws extended, gripping Tom's thermal shirt as he was carried toward the basement door. But as they passed the nursery, something extraordinary happened. Shadow's body went rigid, every muscle tensed like a coiled spring. His ears flattened against his head, and a sound emerged from his throat that Tom had never heard before. Not a meow or hiss, but a guttural warning that seemed to come from somewhere primal and ancient. It was the sound cats make when confronting a predator, when every instinct screams that death is near. Tom paused, feeling goosebumps rise on his arms that had nothing to do with the cold. Through the nursery's cracked door, he could see Emma's crib in the soft glow of her nightlight. The baby was sleeping peacefully, her tiny chest rising and falling in perfect rhythm. Everything looked normal, but Shadow's reaction was anything but normal. For a moment, Tom almost opened the nursery door, almost listened to the animal that had lived in his house for 3 years without causing any trouble, almost trusted the instinct that was making his own skin crawl with unexplained dread. Instead, he continued to the basement, depositing Shadow in the finished rec room, where the cat immediately began throwing himself against the door with renewed desperation. The scratching and yowling that followed would haunt Tom's dreams for months afterward, not because it was loud, but because of what happened while that door stayed closed. Upstairs, Sarah Miller nursed Emma in the pre-dawn darkness, exhausted but content. At 28, she'd waited years for this perfect moment. Her own home, a healthy baby, a husband who worked hard to provide for their family. The nursery was everything she'd dreamed of: soft yellow walls, hand-me-down furniture from her sister, and a mobile of dancing butterflies that cast gentle shadows in the nightlight's glow. She didn't notice that those shadows were moving wrong. She didn't smell the faint sweetness that was growing stronger, and she couldn't hear Shadow's increasingly frantic cries from the basement, muffled by 2 floors and her own contented humming. Emma finished nursing and settled back into her crib with the easy satisfaction of a well-fed baby. Sarah kissed her daughter's forehead, So warm, she noted with a brief flicker of concern, and returned to her own bed. The house settled into what she believed was peaceful silence. 2 floors below, Shadow had stopped throwing himself against the door, not because he'd given up, but because he'd found something else. The basement's far corner, behind Tom's workbench, housed the furnace and water heater. Shadow had never paid much attention to this area before, but now he was drawn to it like a magnet. The same sweet chemical smell was stronger here, mixing with something else. The metallic scent of danger that made his pupils dilate and his heart race. He squeezed behind the workbench, his orange fur collecting dust and cobwebs, following his nose toward a truth that would change everything. There, where the gas line connected to the furnace, Shadow found what his senses had been screaming about for days. A small crack in the fitting, barely visible to human eyes, but large enough to release a steady stream of natural gas into the basement air. The same gas that was slowly seeping upward through the house's ventilation system, accumulating in the nursery where warm air naturally rose. The same gas that, by morning, would reach a concentration that would make one small spark, from a light switch, a static discharge, or the baby's electronic mobile, turn the Miller house into a fireball. Shadow pawed at the crack, his claws scraping against metal. He couldn't fix it, couldn't make the humans understand, couldn't stop the invisible death that was filling their home breath by breath. All he could do was continue crying, continue trying, continue being dismissed as a nuisance by the very people he was desperate to save. But Shadow wasn't just any cat. He was a survivor who'd spent his first year living on the streets before Sarah found him half-starved behind a dumpster. He'd learned that giving up meant death, and he'd learned that sometimes the impossible just required a different approach. If the humans wouldn't listen to his cries, maybe they'd listen to something else, something that would force them to pay attention, something that would save baby Emma's life. As the first grey light of dawn began to filter through the basement windows, Shadow began to plan. What Shadow did next would break every rule of typical cat behavior and reveal an intelligence that scientists are only beginning to understand. By 5 a.m., the gas concentration in the nursery had reached 12%, not yet explosive, but climbing steadily toward the 15% threshold that would turn Emma's bedroom into a death trap. Shadow could smell it from the basement, a sweet chemical signature that grew stronger with each passing hour. The orange tabby had tried everything his instincts suggested. Crying had failed. Direct confrontation with Tom had failed. Now, as he surveyed the basement in the growing daylight, Shadow's survival brain began calculating new possibilities. The basement had 2 ways out. The door Tom had locked, and a small window near the ceiling that led to the backyard. Shadow had never used that window. It was barely large enough for his 18-pound frame, but desperate times demanded desperate measures. What happened next would later be studied by animal behaviorists at Iowa State University. Shadow didn't just escape, he engineered a rescue. First, he needed to get out without alerting the family too early. The gas leak was worst in the morning hours when the furnace cycled most frequently. If he woke them now, they might turn on lights or use electrical switches before ventilating the house, triggering the very explosion he was trying to prevent. Shadow squeezed through the basement window with determination that left patches of orange fur on the frame. Outside, the February air hit him like a physical blow, 20 degrees below zero with a wind chill that made his eyes water. He'd been an indoor cat for 3 years. His paws had never touched snow this deep, and his domesticated body wasn't prepared for the brutal cold. But Emma was upstairs, breathing poisoned air with each tiny breath. Phase 1 of Shadow's plan was noise, but not the kind the family could ignore. He needed help from the outside. Shadow made his way to the miller's next-door neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who fed stray cats and always had her kitchen light on before dawn. At 5:15 a.m., Shadow began throwing himself against Mrs. Patterson's sliding glass door with a violence that shattered the morning quiet. Not the gentle pawing of a cat wanting attention, but the desperate impact of an animal who understood that seconds mattered. Mrs. Patterson, 73 and a light sleeper, heard what sounded like someone trying to break into her house. She called 911 immediately, reporting a possible burglar in her backyard. Within minutes, Cedar Rapids police officer Jake Morrison was driving through the pre-dawn darkness, his patrol car's headlights cutting through the swirling snow. Morrison expected to find teenagers vandalizing property, or perhaps a raccoon in the garbage. Instead, he found an orange cat sitting perfectly still in Mrs. Patterson's yard, staring directly at the Miller house with an intensity that made the hair on the officer's neck stand up. "Hey there, buddy," Morrison said, stepping out of his patrol car. He'd grown up with cats and recognized stress when he saw it. This wasn't a lost pet or a hungry stray. This was an animal in the grip of pure, focused terror. Shadow didn't run when Morrison approached. Instead, he did something that would replay in the officer's mind for years afterward. The cat walked directly to Morrison, sat down, and looked up at him with green eyes that seemed almost human in their desperation. Then Shadow turned toward the Miller house and began to meow. Not the frantic yowling from earlier, but a steady, rhythmic sound that felt like communication. Morrison followed Shadow's gaze to the Miller house, and that's when he noticed what the family inside could not. A faint shimmer in the air around the house's foundation vents, visible only in the patrol car's headlights. Gas vapor, condensing in the brutal cold. "Jesus," Morrison whispered, reaching for his radio. But Shadow wasn't done. The cat stood up and began walking toward the Miller house with purposeful steps, looking back every few feet to ensure Morrison was following. When they reached the front door, Shadow did something that defied every piece of conventional wisdom about feline behavior. He began scratching at the door with systematic precision, not the random clawing of an anxious pet, but a clear pattern. 3 short scratches, pause. 3 long scratches, pause. 3 short scratches, pause. Morrison had been a Boy Scout 40 years ago, and the pattern made his blood run cold. Shadow was scratching SOS in Morse code. Inside the house, Tom Miller was beginning his morning routine, unaware that his basement prisoner had escaped or that death was seeping through his home's ventilation system. The furnace had cycled on at 5:30 a.m., pushing gas-contaminated air through the ductwork with deadly efficiency. The concentration in Emma's nursery was now approaching 14%. Sarah was in the shower, singing softly to herself as she prepared for another day of new motherhood. The bathroom fan, pulling air through the house's ventilation system, was actually accelerating the gas buildup in other rooms. Emma lay in her crib, her tiny body working harder than it should to process each breath. The gas wasn't just building up in the air, it was displacing oxygen, creating a slow-motion suffocation that her 3-month-old lungs couldn't compensate for. Her skin had taken on a subtle pallor that would have alarmed any pediatric nurse, but in the soft light of the nursery, it was barely noticeable. Shadow's scratching grew more intense, his claws leaving deep grooves in the Miller's front door. Morrison had radioed for the fire department and was now pounding on the door himself, but the combination of running water from Sarah's shower and Tom's morning radio in the kitchen masked the sound. That's when Shadow implemented phase 2 of his impossible plan. Cats don't typically show loyalty to humans. They've only known for 3 years. They don't risk their lives for anyone except their offspring. They don't understand concepts like sacrifice or heroism, but Shadow wasn't behaving like a typical cat. He was behaving like someone who understood that Emma's life depended on getting her family's attention right now. Shadow left Morrison at the front door and ran around to the backyard, where he knew Tom's bedroom window was located on the 2nd floor. The window was closed against the winter cold, but Shadow had noticed something during his 3 years in the house. The window frame was loose, rattling in strong winds. What Shadow did next would require every muscle in his 18-pound frame and all the courage he'd learned during his year on the streets. He began climbing the back of the house. Cats are natural climbers, but not in 20-degree weather with snow-covered surfaces and no margin for error. Shadow's claws found purchase in the narrow gaps between aluminum siding, his muscles burning with effort as he pulled himself up inch by agonizing inch. The cold was sapping his strength and making his paws numb, but he kept climbing. Halfway up, he slipped. For a heart-stopping moment, Shadow fell backward, his claws scraping against the siding as he tried to arrest his fall. He hit the snow-covered ground hard, the impact knocking the wind from his lungs and sending shooting pain through his left hind leg. A normal house cat would have retreated at that point, found somewhere warm to recover, waited for the humans to figure out their own problems. Shadow looked up at Tom's bedroom window, thought about Emma's labored breathing, and began climbing again. This time he made it. At 5:45 a.m., Tom Miller was jolted awake by a sound he'd never heard before. Claws scratching against glass with desperate intensity, accompanied by yowling that seemed to carry every ounce of emotion in Shadow's small body. The cat was somehow outside his second-story window, hanging from the loose frame, using his body weight to make the glass rattle like machine gun fire. Tom stumbled to the window, certain he was dreaming. But there was Shadow, orange fur dusted with snow, green eyes blazing with urgency, creating enough noise to wake the dead. And that noise might have just saved Emma's life. Because when Tom opened that window to see what had gotten into his cat, the first thing that hit him was the smell, sweet, chemical and wrong, rushing out of his house into the clean winter air. The smell of natural gas, the smell of death, barely held in check. Tom Miller had exactly 7 minutes to get his family out of the house before the gas concentration reached the explosive threshold, and he didn't know it. The moment Tom opened his bedroom window, Shadow didn't wait for an invitation. The cat launched himself through the opening with the last of his strength, landing hard on the bedroom floor. His left hind leg, injured from the fall, buckled beneath him, but he immediately began limping toward the door, looking back at Tom with eyes that burned with desperate communication. "Sarah!" Tom shouted, the smell of gas now unmistakable in the bedroom's air. "Sarah, we need to get out now." The shower was still running. Sarah couldn't hear him over the water and her own voice humming a lullaby. But Emma could hear her father's panic, and for the first time in hours the baby began to cry, a weak, oxygen-starved sound that made Tom's blood freeze. Shadow was already limping down the hallway, his injured leg leaving small drops of blood on the hardwood floor. He stopped at the nursery door, looked back at Tom, and began that same urgent scratching pattern he'd used outside. 3 short. Tom didn't know Morse code, but he understood desperation. He pushed past Shadow into the nursery and saw something that would haunt his nightmares forever. Emma's lips had a blue tinge that didn't belong on any living child. Outside, Officer Morrison had been joined by Fire Captain Rebecca Walsh and her emergency response team. Walsh had 16 years of experience with gas leaks, and the readings from her portable detector made her stomach drop. The concentration around the house's foundation was already at dangerous levels, and it was climbing. "We need to evacuate the entire block," Walsh radioed to dispatch, "and get ComEd out here to shut off the main line. This thing could blow any second." But Morrison was thinking about the orange cat who'd led him here, who'd scratched SOS on a door, who'd somehow understood that time was running out. "Captain, there's a baby in that house, 3 months old." Walsh looked at the Miller house, its windows glowing warmly in the dawn light, completely unaware that they were living inside a bomb. "How long do you think we have?" Morrison didn't answer. He was already running toward the house, knowing that every second of debate was a second closer to disaster. Inside, Tom had scooped Emma from her crib and was shaking Sarah's shoulder through the bathroom door. "Emergency, gas leak, we have to go right now." Sarah's maternal instincts overrode everything else. She didn't ask questions, didn't grab clothes, or worry about modesty. She wrapped herself in a towel and ran for her baby, her bare feet slapping against the cold hardwood floors. But Shadow wasn't done saving lives. As the Miller family rushed toward the stairs, Shadow made a choice that would define the rest of his life. Instead of following them to safety, he limped toward the basement door that Tom had locked him behind hours earlier. The door was still closed, but Shadow could smell something the humans couldn't. Mrs. Patterson's elderly cat, Whiskers, who'd somehow gotten into the Miller's basement through the same window Shadow had used to escape. Whiskers was trapped down there, breathing air that was now 20% natural gas. The old cat was probably unconscious by now, maybe already dead. Shadow could follow the Millers to safety, or he could try to save another animal who couldn't save himself. The choice took less than a second. Shadow threw his injured body against the basement door, his claws scratching frantically at the lock mechanism. The door was solid oak, installed by Tom's grandfather when the house was built in 1987. Shadow weighed 18 pounds. The physics were impossible. But impossible had been Shadow's specialty all morning. Tom Miller was halfway down the stairs with Emma when he heard the scratching behind him. He turned to see Shadow attacking the basement door with a violence that defied his injury, his small body creating impacts that shook the door frame. "Shadow, come on!" Tom shouted. "We have to go." Shadow stopped scratching and looked at Tom with eyes that contained entire conversations. Then he looked at the basement door and began that soft, urgent meowing that had started this whole nightmare. The sound of a creature who knew something the humans didn't. Tom Miller had ignored that sound for hours. He wouldn't make that mistake again. Handing Emma to Sarah, Tom unlocked the basement door. The smell that rushed out was overwhelming, concentrated gas mixed with the musty scent of unconsciousness. And there, at the bottom of the stairs, was Whiskers. Mrs. Patterson's 15-year-old tabby collapsed on his side, barely breathing. Shadow limped down the stairs as fast as his injured leg would allow, nudging Whiskers with his nose, trying to stimulate consciousness through sheer force of will. But Whiskers was too far gone, his old body overwhelmed by the gas poisoning. Tom didn't hesitate. He scooped up both cats, one under each arm, and ran for the front door where Morrison was already waiting with the fire department. The moment Tom opened the front door, Captain Walsh's gas detector began screaming. The concentration inside the house was now at 14.7%, less than half a percentage point from explosion level. "Everyone out, now!" Walsh shouted, but Tom was already stumbling into the snow with his family and 2 cats, his bare feet sinking into the frozen ground, Emma crying weakly in Sarah's arms. Morrison grabbed them all and hustled them across the street to his patrol car, its heater already running. Sarah clutched Emma to her chest, tears streaming down her face as she realized how close they'd come to losing everything. But Shadow wasn't thinking about close calls or miracle rescues. He was focused on Whiskers, who was still unconscious and barely breathing in Tom's arms. The old cat needed more help than body heat and fresh air could provide. Shadow began licking Whiskers' face with systematic precision, the same grooming behavior cats use to stimulate newborn kittens. But this wasn't casual grooming. This was medical intervention, designed to stimulate blood flow and encourage breathing. For 3 minutes, Shadow licked and nudged and purred against Whiskers' still form, while the humans called veterinarians and argued about emergency clinics. It was Morrison who finally noticed that Whiskers' breathing was getting stronger, his color improving with each of Shadow's determined ministrations. "I'll be damned," the officer whispered. "That cat's doing CPR." At 6:23 a.m., Comed shut off the gas main to the Miller house. By 6:45, the fire department had cleared the building and confirmed what Shadow had known for hours. A cracked fitting on the furnace had been leaking gas for at least a week, filling the house with enough natural gas to level the entire structure. Emma Miller was rushed to Cedar Rapids Medical Center, where doctors confirmed what her parents had been too frightened to acknowledge. The baby was suffering from mild gas poisoning, her oxygen levels dangerously low. Another hour in that house would have caused permanent brain damage. 2 hours might have been fatal, but Emma would be fine, her parents would be fine. Whiskers would recover after spending the day on oxygen at the emergency veterinary clinic. And Shadow, his left hind leg wrapped in a protective bandage, would become something he'd never been before. Not just a house cat, but a genuine hero whose story would spread far beyond Cedar Rapids, Iowa. But the most important part of Shadow's story was still to come, because what he did that morning was only the beginning of a bond that would change everyone who witnessed it. What happened in the days following the gas leak would challenge everything the Miller family thought they knew about intelligence, loyalty, and the capacity for love in creatures they'd once considered mere pets. Emma spent 2 days in the pediatric unit at Cedar Rapids Medical Center, her tiny body working to clear the natural gas from her system. The doctors were optimistic. She was young enough that full recovery was likely. But Sarah hadn't left her daughter's bedside since the ambulance arrived. Tom alternated between the hospital and dealing with the aftermath at home, gas company investigators, insurance adjusters, and the growing media attention that came with a story about a hero cat. But every few hours he found himself thinking about those green eyes staring at him through the bedroom window, about the desperate intelligence he dismissed as nuisance behavior. Shadow had saved his family's life, and Tom had almost locked him in a basement to die. The orange tabby was staying temporarily at Mrs. Patterson's house while the Miller's home was being ventilated and repaired. His injured leg was healing well, according to the veterinarian, but Shadow wasn't acting like a recovering patient. He was acting like a guardian whose job wasn't finished. Every morning at dawn, Shadow positioned himself at Mrs. Patterson's front window, watching the Miller house across the street. When Tom's car pulled into the driveway, Shadow's ears would perk up. When Tom left for the hospital, Shadow would pace Mrs. Patterson's living room with restless energy that made the elderly woman worry. "He knows something's not right," she told Tom during one of his brief stops home. "Cats don't usually fixate like this unless there's still danger." Tom had learned to listen when people talked about Shadow's instincts. On the third day, while Sarah dozed in the hospital chair beside Emma's crib, something extraordinary happened. Emma opened her eyes and, for the first time since the gas leak, focused clearly on her surroundings. Her color was good, her breathing easy, her tiny fingers grasping at the mobile above her bed. The baby was going to be fine. But when Sarah called Tom with the good news, she mentioned something else, something that made him drop everything and drive straight to Mrs. Patterson's house. "Tom, you need to see this," Mrs. Patterson said when he arrived. She led him to her living room window, where Shadow sat in his usual watching position. "He's been like this for the past hour, ever since about 2 o'clock. 2 o'clock was exactly when Emma had opened her eyes for the first time." "How could he possibly know?" Tom whispered, staring at the cat who seemed to be monitoring his family's recovery from a mile away. Mrs. Patterson, who'd lived with cats for 60 years, had a theory that sounded impossible but felt true. "I think he's bonded with that baby in a way we don't understand. Some animals, especially ones that have been through trauma, develop connections that go beyond normal behavior. It's like he's appointed himself Emma's guardian." That night, Tom made a decision that surprised even himself. He brought Shadow back to the Miller house, even though it wasn't fully repaired yet, even though they were still staying at Tom's brother's place across town. He wanted to see what Shadow would do. The cat walked straight to the nursery, sat down in the middle of the empty room and began purring. Not the casual purr of a content pet, but a deep, rhythmic sound that seemed to fill the space with healing energy. Tom had read somewhere that cat purrs vibrate at frequencies that promote bone healing and reduce pain. Maybe Shadow was somehow preparing the room for Emma's return. Over the next week, as the house was cleared for habitation and Emma was discharged from the hospital, Shadow's behavior evolved from protective to almost mystical. He seemed to anticipate the baby's needs before Sarah recognized them herself. When Emma was getting hungry, Shadow would appear at Sarah's elbow and begin his soft meowing. When the baby was about to wake from a nap, Shadow would already be sitting beside the crib. Most remarkably, Shadow had appointed himself Emma's sleep guardian. Every night he positioned himself on the floor beside her crib, remaining perfectly still until morning. If Emma stirred or made the slightest sound of distress, Shadow would immediately stand and begin the soft purring that seemed to calm her instantly. "It's like he's monitoring her breathing," Sarah told Tom one evening as they watched Shadow's vigil from the nursery doorway. "He's making sure she's okay every single moment." Tom, who'd once considered Shadow nothing more than an expensive nuisance, was beginning to understand something profound about the relationship between humans and animals. Shadow wasn't just living in their house. He was actively caring for their child with a dedication that rivaled their own. But the most incredible demonstration of Shadow's transformation came 3 weeks after the gas leak, during Emma's first real health scare since coming home from the hospital. It was a Tuesday evening when Emma developed a mild fever. Nothing dramatic, just the kind of minor illness that all babies experience. Sarah gave her some infant acetaminophen and planned to call the pediatrician in the morning if the fever persisted. Shadow had other plans. At 2 a.m., Shadow began his urgent scratching pattern on Tom and Sarah's bedroom door. Not the frantic desperation of the gas leak night, but the same rhythmic SOS that had saved their lives weeks earlier. Tom found Shadow sitting beside Emma's crib, staring at the baby with the same intense focus he'd shown during the gas emergency. Emma looked fine, sleeping peacefully, breathing normally, no obvious signs of distress. But when Tom touched his daughter's forehead, his heart stopped. Emma's fever had spiked dramatically in just a few hours. Her skin was burning hot, and she was beginning to show signs of dehydration that Sarah had missed in her exhausted state. Shadow had detected the change before any human could have noticed it. Emma spent another night in the hospital, this time for a minor kidney infection that could have become serious without early intervention. The doctors praised Tom and Sarah for catching the fever spike so quickly. Tom never told them it was the cat who'd made the diagnosis. By the time Emma was 6 months old, the bond between her and Shadow had become something the family couldn't imagine living without. Shadow was more than a pet. He was Emma's companion, protector, and advocate. When she learned to sit up, Shadow positioned himself behind her to cushion potential falls. When she started eating solid food, Shadow somehow knew to avoid the dining room during mealtimes, preventing the contamination issues that plagued other families with pets. Most importantly, Shadow had taught the Miller family something about paying attention, about listening to warnings that come in unexpected forms, about respecting intelligence that doesn't speak in human language. Tom Miller was no longer the man who locked crying animals in basements. Sarah had developed an almost mystical respect for Shadow's insights about Emma's needs. Even Emma, now babbling and reaching for everything in sight, seemed to understand that Shadow was special. Her first word wasn't mama or dada. It was Shadow, spoken with perfect clarity while reaching for the orange fur that had become her constant comfort. But Shadow's story was about to take one final turn that would prove his heroism extended far beyond a single family and far beyond a single night of gas leaks and desperate rescues. 1 year later, Shadow's actions would inspire a discovery that changed emergency response protocols across the Midwest. But that transformation began with a simple knock on the Miller family's door. Dr. Angela Foster from Iowa State University's Animal Behavior Research Center had heard about Shadow through a network of veterinarians and emergency responders who'd been quietly documenting unusual cases of animal intelligence. She arrived at the Miller home on a crisp October afternoon, exactly 8 months after the gas leak, with equipment that looked more like space-age technology than veterinary tools. "I'm studying cases where domestic animals have demonstrated problem-solving abilities that exceed normal parameters," she explained to Tom and Sarah as Emma played on the living room floor, Shadow watching from his usual protective position nearby. What Shadow did wasn't just heroic, it was strategic, multi-layered, and showed an understanding of cause and effect that we rarely see in any species. Dr. Foster spent 3 days at the Miller house, observing Shadow's interactions with the family, particularly his relationship with Emma. What she documented would eventually be published in the Journal of Veterinary Behavior and cited in emergency response training programs across the country. Shadow's behavior patterns weren't random acts of intelligence. They were consistent, teachable, and, most importantly, replicable. "He's not just bonded with Emma," Dr. Foster explained during her final interview with the family. "He's monitoring her vital signs through sensory mechanisms we're only beginning to understand. His positioning during her sleep, his response to her breathing patterns, his ability to detect illness before clinical symptoms appear. These behaviors suggest a level of medical awareness that could be trained into other animals." The research Dr. Foster conducted at the Miller home became the foundation for a pilot program that trained shelter cats to work alongside medical personnel in pediatric units. The program, known informally as Shadow's Watch, paired cats with chronically ill children, allowing the animals enhanced sensory abilities to supplement traditional medical monitoring. Within 2 years, hospitals in Iowa, Minnesota, and Wisconsin were reporting measurably improved outcomes for children whose care included trained therapy cats. The cats weren't replacing medical equipment, but they were providing early warning systems for changes in patient condition that electronic monitors sometimes missed. Shadow, meanwhile, had become something of a celebrity. His story appeared in Reader's Digest, was featured on local television news programs, and inspired countless social media posts about heroic pets. But fame didn't change his fundamental nature. He remained completely focused on Emma's well-being, treating media attention as an annoying interruption to his real job. By Emma's first birthday, Shadow's protective instincts had evolved into something resembling actual childcare. He seemed to understand that Emma was mobile now, crawling around the house and getting into the kinds of trouble that 1-year-olds specialize in. Shadow appointed himself her safety coordinator, positioning himself between Emma and potential hazards like stairs, sharp corners, or Tom's toolbox. "It's like having a furry babysitter," Sarah told a reporter from the Cedar Rapids Gazette. "He's more attentive to Emma's safety than some human caregivers I've seen." But the most profound change was in Tom Miller himself. The man who'd once considered animals as simple creatures with simple needs had become an advocate for animal intelligence research. He started volunteering at the local animal shelter, helping match cats with families who would appreciate their full potential. He'd learned something that changed his entire worldview. Intelligence comes in many forms, and loyalty isn't limited to species that walk on two legs. The Miller family's story took another unexpected turn when Mrs. Patterson, their elderly neighbor, suffered a stroke during Emma's second winter. Shadow, who'd maintained a friendship with Mrs. Patterson since his temporary stay at her house, somehow sensed the emergency before human neighbors realized anything was wrong. On a snowy February morning, exactly 2 years after the gas leak, Shadow appeared at Mrs. Patterson's sliding glass door, exhibiting the same desperate behavior that had initially brought Officer Morrison to the scene. This time, Morrison was off duty, but his replacement recognized Shadow immediately and took the cat's distress seriously. Mrs. Patterson was found unconscious on her kitchen floor, having suffered a massive stroke sometime during the night. Emergency responders credited Shadow's alert with saving her life. Another few hours without medical attention would have been fatal. The incident made national news. Shadow was featured on Good Morning America, where his story inspired viewers to pay closer attention to their own pets' behavior. Animal behaviorists from universities across the country began studying what they called the shadow effect, the phenomenon of domestic animals developing enhanced protective behaviors toward human family members. But for Tom, Sarah, and Emma Miller, Shadow's fame was less important than the daily reality of living with an animal who'd fundamentally changed their understanding of family. Emma's first complete sentence, spoken on her second birthday, was directed at Shadow. "Thank you for saving me, Kitty." She couldn't possibly understand the full meaning of those words, but Shadow seemed to. He approached her with the same gentle purr that had comforted her as a newborn, rubbing against her small hands with a contentment that spoke of a job well done. As Emma grew into a curious, healthy toddler, Shadow's role evolved from guardian to companion. He taught her gentleness through his own patient example, never using his claws even when she pulled his tail or grabbed his whiskers with toddler enthusiasm. He became her reading partner, sitting quietly beside her during story time, and her comfort during thunderstorms, when his steady purring could calm her fears better than any lullaby. The gas leak that nearly destroyed the Miller family had become the foundation of something beautiful, a bond that transcended species and proved that heroism often comes in unexpected packages. Dr. Foster's research, inspired by Shadow's actions, eventually led to the establishment of the Companion Animal Early Warning Network, a collaboration between veterinary schools and emergency services that trained animals to recognize and alert humans to various dangers. Shadow became the program's unofficial mascot. His story used to illustrate the profound intelligence hiding in shelter cats across the country. 5 years after that February night, Tom Miller stood in his backyard watching Emma, now a confident 5-year-old, playing with Shadow in the snow. The orange tabby was showing his age, moving a bit slower, sleeping a bit longer, but his devotion to Emma never wavered. When she fell and scraped her knee, Shadow was there first, offering comfort in the form of gentle head bumps and that healing purr. When she succeeded at something new, like riding her bike or spelling her name, Shadow seemed to celebrate with her, his tail high and his eyes bright with shared joy. Sarah said, joining Tom at the window, "I used to think we rescued Shadow from that dumpster behind the grocery store, but I think maybe he rescued us." Tom nodded, watching his daughter and the cat who'd saved her life playing in the same yard, where Shadow had once climbed a house in sub-zero temperatures, driven by nothing but love and determination. The Miller house had been fully repaired years ago, with new gas lines and modern safety systems, but the real safety system, the orange tabby who'd appointed himself Emma's lifelong protector, remained unchanged, constant, and irreplaceable. That night, as Emma settled into her bed for story time, Shadow took his familiar position on the floor beside her. His injured leg from that desperate climb still bothered him on cold nights, but he never missed his evening vigil. As Sarah read about brave princes and magical kingdoms, Shadow's purr provided the soundtrack, a deep rumble of contentment that seemed to say everything was right in their world. Emma's small hand dangled over the side of her bed, her fingers buried in Shadow's soft fur. "Daddy says you're a hero, Shadow," she whispered as her eyes grew heavy. "But I think you're just my best friend." Shadow's purr deepened, and for a moment, Tom could swear he saw the cat smile. That night, the dog didn't just save a life, He saved hope itself, proving that love comes in many forms, and sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who never expected to be heroic at all.